Thank you. Is that working? Yep. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here. It's an honor for me to speak about Mr. Panza and my relationship with him and his family over the years. Okay, so look, this is, when I look at this photograph and I see the joy on Mr. Panza's face, this is how I remember him so well. You know, I met Mr. and Mrs. Panza in the early 1990s in New York when I was living in a windowless studio near the fish market on the edge of Manhattan.
Il maestro ringrazia ovviamente per l'invito e soprattutto a parlare non solo del suo rapporto di artista con il signor Panza, bensì anche del rapporto che ha avuto con la sua famiglia quando ancora era un giovane artista e aveva uno studio a Manhattan. E quindi gli piace ricordarlo, ha visto mostrando questa foto dove lui è sorridente, cioè mostrando il sorriso sul volto, perché è come lo ricorda quando l'ha conosciuto.
When you're a young artist and you're making your work and you're alone with the work, you never know where it's going to go and you never know who is going to see it. And there are moments in your life when someone can come into your studio and they can look at what you do and it can profoundly change your life. And I remember when Mr. and Mrs. Panza visited me in my studio. I called it the cave because it had no windows. It had, it was all closed on the front. It was in a very poor area of town. It was a difficult time in my life. I was going through a separation and my children had just moved away. So it was a good time and also a difficult time for me. And I remember well the visit when Mr. and Mrs. Panza came. I don't remember exactly who brought them there into the studio, whether it was my gallerist or somebody else. But they spent quite a while looking, and of course I was nervous, so I was kind of hiding in the back of the studio. And what impressed me about the visit, and then the subsequent visits throughout the years that Mr. and Mrs. Panza would visit my studio, and often then later with Giuseppina, he never asked me a question about my paintings. And there's been few collectors through my experience where I have experienced that, where they walk in, they spend a long time, they look, but they don't ask questions. He did not need to ask questions because he knew what he was looking at. And if he didn't see something or feel something or have a connection with what he was looking at, I don't think he would have been interested. And that was impressive to me because he didn't have to be convinced, and I certainly didn't want to have to convince him of what I was doing. He was convinced by looking.
Il maestro ricorda la prima volta che appunto i signori Panza sono entrati nel suo studio, che in realtà quando si è un giovane artista e si sta attraversando un momento molto difficile della propria vita, nella fattispecie anche una separazione, quindi anche un distacco dai figli, e oltretutto questo studio lui lo aveva ribattezzato la grotta perché non aveva finestre, era povero, era molto, molto spoglio, e lui ricorda benissimo questo, anche se non ricorda esattamente chi sia stato, no? A condurre i signori Panza nel suo studio, però ricorda perfettamente questo momento perché poi gli avrebbe cambiato la vita. Quando sei un giovane artista appunto e ancora non sai dove devi arrivare, possono esserci questo tipo di incontri che ti cambiano la vita. Poi la cosa più bella e quello che lo ha impressionato di più è il fatto che Panza non gli abbia mai fatto domande. Dice: la maggior parte dei critici d'arte o dei collezionisti ti riempiono di domande. Lui in realtà non aveva bisogno di chiedermi, di farmi domande sui miei dipinti, su quello che io, sulle mie opere, perché lui le capiva e sapeva che cosa io volevo dare appunto nelle mie opere. Quindi è una cosa che lo ha colpito particolarmente.
It's not easy being a collector. It may look easy for many. You know, you think that they're able to buy the work or they're able to afford the work. So maybe it's easy to buy things. I would say that's true. But to have a vision, it's not so easy. And if you look over the years and over the scope and the depth of the collection that Mr. and Mrs. Panza were able to acquire, and the diversity of the work, the complexity of the work, the beauty of the work, it's an extraordinary vision of a man to have the ability to assemble this kind of a collection through the years. You know, I think often when I had read his memoirs, and I'm not going to remember it exactly, but there's a passage in the book where he speaks about as a young child, and he's driving through, he's in the car and he's looking at the landscape outside the window, the horizontal landscape, maybe the mountains near Varese and the sky. And when I read that, I immediately knew why he loved Rothko, you know, why he understood Rothko, and why he connected to Rothko. You know, it's from his experiences and his sensitivity. You know, I think, you know, I imagine a lot in the late 50s and the early 60s of how it was living in Milan, and then his attraction to New York, and not only to New York, but to the far west, to the edge of the United States, and the artists that were working out there with the light and the space and the openness. And you know, this was a time in Los Angeles where Los Angeles was not a destination point. There weren't the great museums that they have today. There was a few, but it was nowhere near what it is today. I grew up there. My family immigrated from Australia, and we arrived in 1958 into America. And the reason that I left in 1984 to move to New York was to be a painter, because the community within Los Angeles at that time was so small. So what was this man from Milan doing in the West, looking for things? And how did he find that? How did he find these artists, and how did he meet these artists, and how did he discover these works that nobody else was looking at?
Allora, essere un collezionista può essere anche facile, perché basterebbe acquistare delle opere. Invece la differenza di Panza e dei signori Panza era proprio questa di avere una visione, altrimenti non avrebbe Panza rivolto la sua attenzione non solo verso il New York, ma anche verso il Far West, cioè verso destinazioni come potevano essere appunto Los Angeles, cioè dove appunto il maestro è cresciuto. E lui, leggendo proprio le memorie di Panza, ha capito come mai lui avesse questa visione, perché parla di quando era un bambino e viaggiando in macchina dal finestrino poteva vedere, non so, le montagne, i panorami, ed è per questo che il maestro ha capito anche perché sapeva apprezzare Rothko, perché quando il maestro viveva negli anni 60 a Los Angeles, non era diciamo una meta di grandi, non c'erano grandi gallerie, non c'erano grandi musei, non era una meta dove un collezionista potesse andare appunto per prelevare opere oppure conoscere artisti. E quindi appunto un uomo che aveva una visione, lui ha scritto Visionary, un uomo lungimirante, potremmo tradurre in italiano, no? Perché visionario in italiano non ha una buona accezione, ha capito come mai si poteva interessare di andare a trovare i propri artisti e le proprie opere in un posto che come Los Angeles, che all'epoca non era così importante dal punto di vista del mercato artistico.
Once when I was in Gubbio for an exhibition that Mr. Panza was presenting with a group of other artists, there was a small musical piece that was presented at the opening of the exhibition. I don't remember exactly who had created the work, but it was a very difficult, minimal piece of music. And I remember standing with my wife in the room, looking at all the people, and listening to this piece of music and how difficult it was. It wasn't an easily accessible piece of music. And I remember at that moment, in a way, understanding Mr. Panza even more. You know, he was rich with a sensitivity and an awareness of what was around him. And I noticed this by the work that was being played and his interest in this work. You know, and I imagined him bringing home to his home in Varese or Milan in the early years of his collections the works of these artists that nobody was paying attention to. You know, it was a different time than today, when there's all this speculation and so many collectors are buying for so many reasons, many just to make a profit and then to move on. But he slowly built up this, you know, wonderful, rich, complex collection. And when you look at the scope of it, you know, it wasn't just, you know, a single vision of a particular type of painting, but he crossed over into so many different areas of complexity and diversity. It showed such a scope of understanding and curiosity with what he was able to collect.
Il maestro fa un paragone fra un pezzo musicale che lui ascoltava con la moglie, che ha ascoltato con la moglie, e paragona, ha immaginato, ascoltando questo pezzo, che Panza potesse prestargli attenzione, no? Anche se non era un pezzo famoso, non era una canzone di moda, no? Perché la peculiarità proprio di quest'uomo come collezionista è stata quella della diversificazione e del prestare attenzione a qualcosa che normalmente avere questa sensibilità verso qualcosa che non era poi così di moda, o comunque che sarebbe stato poi, cioè avrebbe rivelato gli artisti che c'erano dietro queste creazioni. Non è facile avere questa visione e questo saper cogliere che cosa è arte. Okay.
Once when I was visiting Villa Panza, there was a presentation of my work in one of the rooms before a room was created for my work. And I visited the room, and I felt that there were too many paintings in the room, too many objects. And I remember going home to California. I was living at California at that time, and I felt that I needed to, you know, write a fax to Mr. Panza saying maybe there's one or two works too many, but I was really nervous about doing so. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to ruin a relationship that I have, but you know, he's always been so honest with me and forthcoming. So I wrote him a fax. We had faxes at that time. This is before the internet. And I remember sending it off nervously. And then in the middle of the night, you know, it's a 9-hour difference, so he must have gotten the fax in the morning. And so I'm in bed, and then I hear the fax machine go. You know, I go, oh. So I remember running down and looking at such a kind response. That, of course, thank you for telling me. I appreciate what you're saying so much. he didn't have this this huge ego where he felt he needed to be right about certain things. Of course, about some things, of course, he needed to be correct about what he was doing with and what he was collecting. But he had such respect for the artist. And I remember a number of years later when there was an exhibition at MoCA in Los Angeles. And Mr. Panza would always make these beautiful plans on graph paper of where he would put the paintings. And he would sit and think for hours, I'm sure, at this beautiful desk that he had in Milan to figure out where the works would go and how he would find them in the space. And then I remember when during the installation he came up to me and said, "Now Lawrence, if there's anything you want me to take away, please let me know and I'll take it away." And I suggested a couple of things that he took away. And I'm saying this to show you that he was sensitive to the artist. He wasn't trying to push what shouldn't be pushed in a way that shouldn't be pushed. And he was respectful and patient.
È un ritratto anche affettivo, perché lui si ricorda quando la prima volta che ha visto quella che era all'epoca la collezione Panza, è rimasto in imbarazzo e non ha avuto il coraggio lì per lì di dire che secondo lui c'era qualcosa di troppo oppure che non fosse ben collocato. E poi invece è tornato a casa a Los Angeles, lo ha scritto, all'epoca c'erano i fax, non c'erano anche questi mezzi di comunicazione che abbiamo oggi, però era un po' in imbarazzo perché si sentiva un po' in imbarazzo rispetto al collezionista, e invece mentre dormiva una notte ha sentito il rumore del fax e è arrivata una risposta cortesissima di Panza che lo ringraziava perché dice lui non aveva questo superego, no? E quindi era sempre sensibile con gli artisti, aveva un rispetto degli artisti, tant'è che anche al MoCA di Los Angeles, no? Gli chiese: "Secondo te, Lawrence, c'è qualcosa che devo togliere? No? Dimmelo." Insomma, aveva questa grande sensibilità e questo grande rispetto per gli artisti ed era sempre gentile nelle sue risposte.
I was in my studio in Venice, Italy. It was May 12th, 2008, and I received an email that Robert Rauschenberg had died. And it was so sad to me. I love this artist and his spirit. So I picked up the phone and I called Mr. Panza to see, just to talk to him. And he had not known yet that he hadn't received the news yet. So we spoke for quite a while about Rauschenberg, his generosity, his gift as an artist, a little bit about their relationship. And Mr. Panza also had this generosity of spirit, of kindness, of helping so many artists, changing when I met Giusy this evening, I told her, this is your father's fault. And she looks at me and she goes, "What do you mean?" And I go, "Well, his support for so many artists enabled them to have such a richer, a deeper career with what they do." As young artists, you make your work, you never know where it's going to go. You never know if anyone's going to appreciate it, support it, acknowledge it. You don't know. You don't imagine when you make the work that 25, 30 years later, you're in Accademia San Luca and you have a painting upstairs and you're talking about this man and the Panza collection, and you're a small part of this history, and you sometimes wonder how this happens, how I was so fortunate to come across him and his support for what I do, and for so many artists. There's a wonderful story that Mrs. Panza tells about Robert Rauschenberg when she was inviting him to come to see his paintings in Varese, the Combine paintings. And she told me that he just started to have tears in his eyes, and he says, "No, I can't come now." And I interpreted this as, because this work was so special to him, so maybe some of his best work ever that he created, I think in a way he may have known that. He needed some distance from this work to be able to move into other work that he's making years later. You know, and it's these kinds of relationships. Anytime that I would see an artist around Mr. Panza and Mrs. Panza, they were always joyful and smiling and hugs and wanting to be in their company. Just a beautiful relationship that he created. And I need to say, it's very important, I hardly ever was with Mr. Panza when Mrs. Panza was not present. And what such an important part of the history of their collection, she's so valuable to them, as also now Giuseppina and her support and interest and hard work and devotion also to this collection. I'll tell you a little personal story, and then I will let everybody else speak. After Mr. Panza died and the day of his funeral, there were some artists that stayed around, and I remember we were having dinner in the restaurant in Varese. And of course, it was an incredibly sad day. And we're sitting there, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us, I don't remember exactly how many. And just about at the end of our dinner, Mrs. Panza came into the room. And we're all a little taken back. And she said something that I'll never forget. She says, "This is where I need to be." She also felt at home around this world of, it's not just collecting, it's much, much deeper than that. She wanted to be a part of it. She wanted to be with us at that evening, to spend a few minutes with us. And she knew that Mr. Panza, I'm sure, would have wanted her to be there. He gave us a great gift. He was an extraordinary man. Not just a collector for me, but a man who exemplified a vision of life and how to live your life and commit your life to the values in which he truly believed in. And I'm honored to speak a little bit about him and to be a small part of his legacy that he's left us. Sorry.
Ma allora la generosità verso gli artisti e soprattutto il valore umano sia di Panza che della sua famiglia, infatti parto dalla fine, difficilmente quando il maestro ha incontrato Panza era da solo, c'era sempre anche la moglie, perché ripeto, parto dalla fine. L'episodio che ha raccontato alla fine il maestro è che durante un pranzo dopo la morte appunto di Panza erano riuniti un po' di artisti in un ristorante a Varese, è arrivata la signora Panza e ha detto: io voglio stare, cioè è qui dove voglio stare con voi come una famiglia. E tornando indietro, il maestro ha raccontato l'esperienza di anche questo afflato che ha avuto di chiamare Panza alla notizia della morte di Rauschenberg, no? E ne hanno parlato parecchio, il Panza ancora non lo sapeva, hanno parlato parecchio del rapporto che avevano, perché lui creava questo rapporto sempre di stretta umanità con tutti gli artisti. Tant'è che anche raccontava anche che durante una visita alle opere di Rauschenberg a un certo punto si è commosso, nonostante poi intorno a Panza ci fosse sempre questa gioia, questa collaborazione da parte di tutti gli artisti. Il maestro si sente fortunato sia di essere qui e di sapere anche, cioè un giovane artista non può immaginarsi dove andrà poi a parare e poi immaginarsi che dopo 25-30 anni potrà avere delle sue opere esposte come qui all'Accademia, quindi di questo è grato, si sente fortunato di aver incontrato questo grande uomo, cioè non un semplice collezionista, bensì un grande uomo.
May I say one more thing? I'll try to make this very quick. I was making my paintings for the Biennale, the last Biennale, and you know, I was going through a difficult time in the studio making this work, and I'm in the studio one night, and late, it's 2 or 3 or 4 in the morning, and I'm taking apart a painting. I'm not happy. I'm looking for something, desperately looking to connect to the painting that I'm making. And I remember I had these canes, these walking canes in my studio, maybe 5 or 6 of them. And I remember going over to one and taking it and breaking it and then putting it with another one. And this is an image of the two touching. But what I wanted to say was that I was at Basel, Art Basel, and I had dinner with Mr. and Mrs. Panza. And I remember them walking into the restaurant, and they both, your mother had a cane for her hip, and Mr. Panza had a cane that he needed for some support for his walking. And they sat down at the table, just very fancy, not fancy, but loud restaurant, and everybody was greeting them. Everybody knew them and who they were. And I remember they put the 2 canes next in this little corner, and I remember the 2 canes touching. I never forgot that. Years later, I'm in my studio in Venice, late at night, working, I'm just telling you, and I take this cane, and I remember instinctively I broke it. And then I remember covering it with dust, hanging it on the painting, and you can see that the top part of the cane made like a hook, and it was inviting, that it needed something else to touch that. And I remember grabbing this other cane and hanging it on that, and then there was these flowers lying around, and I connected them, and that was it. After I make my work, I often look at it and start to understand where it came from. And it came from that moment that I was with your mom and dad. The 2 canes touched, and it spoke to me about so many things personally. And I don't expect anyone, when they look at this painting, to understand that. But it's those moments in life that you're able to find as an artist, to bring them into your studio and bring them into your work, and in some way give your work life. And I really believe deeply that Mr. Panza saw that in my work, and I believe that was his interest in my work, that he felt in some way I was touching or getting close to life. So I just wanted to share that little story.
Il maestro parla di una notte in cui recentemente rispetto purtroppo alla scomparsa di Panza, cercava l'ispirazione, era nel suo studio e cercava ispirazione, e poi c'erano appunto vari oggetti, fra cui dei bastoni, eccetera. Questo legame, lui è profondamente convinto che sia Panza che lui nella sua arte debbano esistere dei legami nel tempo e anche fra le cose, e quindi mentre cercava appunto questa ispirazione, a un certo punto ha preso questo bastone, lo ha messo in un certo modo, l'altro come un uncino, poi c'erano dei fiori appallottolati, e ha creato questa installazione sulla tela, e poi ha avuto quello che noi chiameremo un flash. Si è ricordato di una volta durante un pranzo al ristorante appunto con i signori Panza, e c'erano questi 2 bastoni che lui usava per camminare, che a un certo punto si sono avvicinati, cioè erano appoggiati a un muro e si sono avvicinati. Ecco, lui pensa che questo legame, questo senso di legame fra le cose e fra il passato e anche questa sorta di ispirazione, diciamo, postuma, sia quello proprio che caratterizzava la grandezza appunto di Panza e quello che ha visto il Panza in lui.
Bene, grazie per questa bellissima testimonianza del maestro Carroll. Le ultime immagini che ha proiettato mi suggeriscono anche un'altra assonanza con la piccola mostra intimista da boudoir che abbiamo ospitato al terzo piano, perché in fondo ho rivisto nella domesticità di poche cose poetiche di Carroll, in fondo tutti elementi che possono essere ricondotti a una dimensione dell'archetipo, no? Cassapanche, armadi, panche, ecco, questa dimensione su cui si carica attraverso le trasmutazioni e le trascolorazioni del poco colore che c'è, in fondo la dimensione della nostalgia e della malinconia, che è quello che un po' caratterizza la nostra pinacoteca. Ecco, in questo in fondo c'è l'idea però che da questi elementi possa nascere quella che Carroll, reduce dall'esperienza del padiglione Vaticano con Kudelka e con Studio Azzurro, aveva portato in questa famosa esperienza della rigenerazione, o meglio ancora della ricreazione. E la stessa rigenerazione e ricreazione che troviamo in questi silenzi cari a Carroll, e non è un caso che la mostra del Mambo di Bologna in qualche modo rimandi alla parallela mostra dedicata a Morandi, a quel silenzio morandiano, a quelle poche cose poetiche, a questi elementi domestici che ricordano molto appunto tutto il lavoro di Carroll e anche la nostra esperienza espositiva. Grazie, lascio la parola a Caterina Bon Valsassina.